People never want to say this out loud, but sometimes the very child you gave birth to becomes the person you should have learned to protect yourself from much earlier. I realized that on a very ordinary afternoon, when 2 grocery bags cut deep into my fingers and the house I had lived in for more than 30 years no longer opened its door to me. My name is Margaret, and the moment I'm about to tell you was when everything in my life cracked apart, even though the world outside stood still as if nothing had ever happened. I was used to walking straight to the front door, an old habit of someone who had once been the homeowner. But that day, I went around to the back, following the narrow path that led to the guest house. They told me to stay there for convenience, as if I were just a piece of furniture that no longer fit the new space. I stopped in front of the main door out of reflex and pulled out my key ring. The familiar key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. I tried. Again. The same. The door stood still, cold, distant, unfamiliar. That was when I heard footsteps from the porch. My son, Ethan, was standing there. His back leaned against the railing, phone in hand, looking relaxed, as if everything were firmly under his control. He looked at me without surprise, without hesitation, just a look that had already been prepared. "This house belongs to my wife now," he said evenly. "You're just staying in the back for now." I didn't ask. I didn't argue. I just stood there, still holding the grocery bags, feeling as though someone had lifted the ground out from under my feet. Ethan raised his head slightly, as if to make sure I heard every word. "If you step in there again," he continued, his voice lower but sharper, "I won't hold back anymore." There was no shouting, no loud confrontation, just an invisible line being drawn, and I was standing on the side that no longer counted. If you're quietly listening to this part, perhaps you understand what it's like when the hardest things to hear come from your own family. Here, we tell stories like this, without judgment, just listening. If you choose to stay and listen on, you are not alone. I stood there for a few more seconds, then turned and walked toward the guest house, the place they told me I was temporarily staying. And in that moment, I understood something that still hurts to this day. I wasn't kicked out of the house. I was pushed out of my own child's life. I had been living in the guest house for nearly 3 months when my younger brother, Caleb, arrived. I hadn't told him what was really going on. I only said that I preferred the quiet, that the main house felt too empty after my husband passed away. Caleb didn't ask much over the phone, but I know him. When he said he was coming to visit, I understood that he sensed something was wrong. As soon as Caleb's car pulled into the yard, I stepped outside. I didn't want him to see me coming out from behind the house like hired help. "You live here?" he asked, looking around the cramped little guest house. "Yes," I replied. "It's more convenient." Caleb didn't say anything right away. He just nodded, then looked toward the main house. It still stood there, solid and bright, as if it had never changed owners. But his gaze lingered longer than usual, as if he were piecing together fragments I had tried to hide. "Where's Ethan?" he asked. "In the house," I said. "He's busy." Caleb took a few steps forward, as if he were about to walk straight to the front door. Instinctively, I called out, "Caleb." He turned back to look at me. That look made my throat go dry, not from fear, but from shame. The kind of shame that comes when someone is about to see what you've tried to hide for a long time. "Why aren't you going inside?" he asked. I stayed silent a beat too long. "I'm used to it out here," I finally said. "It's fine." Caleb didn't argue, but he didn't believe me either. I could see it in the way he looked. Around the guest house, the small kitchen, the old chair, the pile of belongings I had brought in a hurry and never properly unpacked. Ethan stepped onto the porch just then. He greeted his uncle normally, even smiled. "You came to visit," Ethan said. "No warning." "Yeah," Caleb replied. "I wanted to see how my sister's living." The air shifted just slightly, but enough for me to feel it clearly. Ethan glanced at me once, then looked away, as if I were no longer something that needed attention in that conversation. Caleb stayed for dinner with me in the guest house. We ate simply. No one raised their voice. No one brought up anything directly, but I knew he was waiting. After I finished clearing the dishes, Caleb pulled out a chair and sat across from me. His hands were clasped together, resting neatly on the table. "Sis," he said quietly, "you signed something, didn't you?" I looked up at my brother. In that moment, I understood that no matter how long I stayed silent, the truth had already begun to surface. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. "It's not simple," I said. Caleb didn't push. He just nodded once, very slowly. "Then," he said, "start from the beginning." And I knew that from that moment on, everything would no longer stay contained within the silence I had tried so hard to keep. I didn't tell Caleb everything that night. Some things, if spoken too soon, make you hear your own weakness more clearly than anyone else. I needed a little more time to gather my thoughts so I could tell the story fully without turning it into a defense of myself. The next morning, we sat at the small table in the guest house. Caleb made the coffee. I poured the milk. Everything moved slowly, the way we had always done things as siblings. "Where did it start?" Caleb asked. "With Henry's will," I said. My voice was calmer than I expected. Henry was my husband. He passed away more than a year ago. Before he died, he had prepared everything carefully, not because he thought he would leave early, but because he didn't want to leave problems behind for those who stayed. All the assets, I continued, the house, the land, the savings, everything was in my name. Caleb didn't look surprised. He knew Henry. He knew his brother-in-law always thought one step ahead of him. But, I paused briefly, there was a clause involving Ethan. Caleb looked up, more attentive now. Henry allowed our son to inherit anything. He simply set conditions. Ethan could only access or manage anything if he treated me properly. No violence, no threats, no pressure to force me into decisions I didn't understand or didn't want. Henry told me, I said, that it wasn't meant to punish our son, but to protect me. And to protect Ethan himself from making bad decisions. Caleb let out a quiet breath and nodded. "Your husband was right to think that way. The problem," I said, "is that I never told Ethan about that clause." Caleb looked at me again. This time, his eyes held. More than scrutiny, there was concern. "I thought," I said slowly, "that I could guide my son in another way, with patience, with love. I thought that if I didn't mention that clause, he wouldn't feel controlled." I looked down at my hands. They had started to tremble slightly, even though I wasn't trying to show it. "I was wrong," I said. "No blame, just a true statement." Caleb was silent for a moment, then asked, "So, who found those papers?" I didn't answer right away. Some names, even when spoken softly, changed the air in the room. "Laura," I said, "Ethan's wife." That day, after Henry's funeral, my house was still full of food people had brought over. The same condolences repeated again and again. Laura offered to help me organize Henry's study. I was exhausted, grieving, and I trusted my daughter-in-law. I left her alone in that room. She saw everything. She knew the house was in my name. She saw the clause about Ethan, and she didn't bring it to me first. She brought it to her husband. After that, I continued, Ethan's attitude began to change. Not all at once, not overnight, just small remarks, comments that sounded harmless, about how I still made all the decisions, about how he was the man of the house, yet nothing was in his name. He stopped asking for my opinion, I said. He started informing me instead. Caleb leaned back in his chair. His face grew serious. "And you stayed silent?" he asked. I nodded. "I thought it was just a phase," I said. "I thought it would pass." Caleb didn't say anything else, but I knew that from that moment on, he understood. And I also understood that what I had kept hidden for so long was no longer just my own secret. If there is one thing I learned later, it's this. Not everyone who hurts you does so with a harsh voice. Laura never raised her voice at me. She spoke softly and politely, always addressing me with what sounded like genuine respect. On the surface, no one would think she was the reason everything in my home began to shift. The changes came very slowly. At first, they were casual remarks I overheard when passing through the living room. Laura talked to Ethan about work, about pressure, about responsibility. She often used the word man in a gentle, almost matter-of-fact way, as if stating something obvious. "You're the backbone," I heard her say once. "You carry this whole family on your shoulders." Ethan stayed quiet. He didn't object. I thought it was just the way a couple encouraged each other. Later, those sentences began to grow an extra ending. "But a backbone has to stand firm," Laura said. "Everything can't stay in someone else's hands forever." She never mentioned me directly. She never said my name. But I knew who that someone else was. Ethan began to change, not outright rude, just less attentive, less open. When I offered advice, he listened, but no longer nodded the way he used to. He would often stay silent, then say briefly, "I know." Laura, meanwhile, stayed the same. She helped me clean, cooked meals, and asked about my health. Once she even brought tea into my room and sat beside me like a thoughtful daughter-in-law. "I'm just worried about him," she said. "Ethan always feels like he's not good enough." I believed her. I truly did. Some evenings I could hear them talking in their bedroom, not arguing, just Laura speaking, Ethan responding quietly. I couldn't make out every word, but I recognized my son's voice. It sounded tired, heavy, as if he were trying to prove something to himself. Gradually, Ethan began saying things that made me stop in my tracks. "This house," he said once, "needs someone to make the decisions eventually." I looked at him, surprised. "What are you talking about?" "If not me," he replied, "then who?" Laura wasn't there at the time, but I knew those questions didn't come from nowhere. One afternoon, I accidentally overheard Laura speaking to her husband, her voice very soft but clear. "I don't need the house in my name," she said. "I just need to know that my husband has authority in his own home." She didn't mention me, but that sentence placed me outside. Ethan didn't answer right away. I heard a long silence. Then he said, "Do you think I'm being looked down on?" Laura replied immediately, "No, I think you're looking down on yourself." After that day, Ethan no longer hesitated the way he used to. He began talking more about reorganizing things, about paperwork, about management rights, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing across from a son who still had the same familiar face, but a different way of seeing. He still loved me. I believed that. But he had begun listening to another voice, and I hadn't realized that it was that very gentleness that was pushing everything further, day by day. Everything broke open on a very ordinary evening. I was standing in the kitchen preparing dinner the way I always had. There was no party, no guests, just a family dinner. Ethan and Laura walked in together. They exchanged a brief look before Ethan placed a stack of papers on the table. "We need to talk," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, but I could hear the tension in the way he held himself upright, as if he had rehearsed this conversation. "What is this?" I asked. "A power of attorney," Ethan replied. "Just temporary, so I can handle the finances, taxes, repairs around the house." Laura stood beside him, her hands clasped together. She looked at me with just enough concern to seem sincere. "Please don't misunderstand," she said. "We just want things to run more smoothly. He's under a lot of pressure." I picked up the papers. The lines were small, full of legal terms. I read slowly, but the more I read, the more uneasy I felt. "Why does this have to be done so urgently?" I asked. "Your father already arranged everything. There's nothing that needs changing." Ethan let out a heavy sigh. "Dad is gone. I'm the man of the house now." That made me look up. "Being a man," I said, "doesn't mean taking power away from your mother." Laura flinched slightly, as if struck. She turned to Ethan at once. "I told you," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "Your mother doesn't trust you." "That's not what I said," I spoke up. "See?" Laura continued, her voice rising slightly. "It's always that she knows best. She decides everything. What place do you even have in this house?" Ethan turned to me, his face flushed, his jaw tightened. "You always want to control everything," he said, "even now." "I won't sign something I don't understand," I replied, placing the papers back on the table. "If you want to discuss things, we can talk another way." The word no had barely left my mouth when I saw his hand move. The slap came fast, no warning, no shouting, just a sharp blow enough to knock my head to the side. I didn't fall, but I had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. The kitchen went completely silent. Laura let out a slight sound, as if she herself were startled. Ethan stood frozen, eyes wide, breathing hard. I looked at my son. He was looking back at me, but that look was no longer the look of the child I once held in my arms. "I will not sign," I said. My voice was low but clear. "Not now, not ever." No one said another word. I turned away, went into my bedroom, and locked the door. My hand trembled as I touched my cheek. The skin burned. I didn't cry. The tears felt stuck somewhere, unwilling to fall. The next morning, I covered the bruise with a thin layer of makeup. I still cooked, still cleaned. I told myself it was just a one-time thing, that he was exhausted, that he would apologize. I chose silence, and that silence gave them time. After that slap, everything didn't explode the way I had imagined. It changed quietly. Laura's family began showing up more often. At first, it was brief visits, then more extended conversations in the living room where I was only invited to sit when another person was needed to make up the numbers. They talked about renovations, about reorganizing the space, about the long-term future. The words sounded reasonable, but I was no longer the one being asked for input. One afternoon when I came back from the market, I found that my bedroom door wouldn't open. The old key no longer fits. I stood there for a moment, grocery bags still in my hands, my mind blank. Ethan came up behind me. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked. "The door," I said. "Why was the lock changed?" "That room is needed for important things," he replied. "Documents. It's not convenient to go in and out." "That's my room," I said. "My bed." Ethan sighed and rubbed his forehead as if I were exhausting him. "You're being too sensitive," he said. "That room isn't suitable anymore." I turned to look at my son. "What are you talking about?" "Stay in the guest house for now," he continued. "Just for a while, to keep things calmer." I didn't answer right away. I stepped forward, placed my hand on the doorknob and tried to turn it again. I wasn't trying to break in. I just needed to get a few clothes. Ethan's hand clamped around my arm. He didn't hit me. He squeezed. The grip was tight and deliberate, enough for me to understand that if I pushed any further, he could do more. "Stop," I said, my voice turning hoarse. "Go to the guest house," he replied. "Don't make this harder." I pulled my arm back, not abruptly, not shouting, just slowly withdrawing it, as if afraid of waking something more dangerous. That night, I packed a small suitcase. Not much. I didn't take memories with me. I only took what was necessary. When I walked out of the main house, no one saw me off. No one asked if I needed help. The guest house was darker than I remembered. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hand resting on the arm that still ached. I looked at the bruise slowly surfacing beneath my skin. I didn't call the police. I didn't call anyone at all. I told myself it wasn't violence, that he was just trying to keep order, that he was still my son. But deep down, I knew I had just been pushed out of a place that was no longer safe. Caleb didn't need to ask much more to understand how far things had gone. He noticed my arm when I reached for the kettle. I had forgotten to cover it. The bruise was still clearly visible, even though I had tried to cover it with long sleeves. "Did Ethan do this?" Caleb asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. I poured the water, set the kettle down, and then sat across from my brother. "It's not serious," I said. "It was just a moment of anger." Caleb stood up. He walked a few steps around the guest house, then turned back. I saw his jaw tighten. "You're talking about violence," he said, "and about being pressured to sign documents." "I didn't sign," I replied, "and I won't." "You were pushed out of your own bedroom," Caleb continued, "and forced to stay here. This is no longer a family issue." I shook my head. "Don't make this bigger than it is." Caleb looked at me for a long time. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired. "Do you know what I would say if someone else told me this story?" he asked. I stayed silent. "I would say to call the police," he said, "immediately." I looked up. "No." The word came out faster than I expected. "No," I repeated. "Don't." Caleb closed his eyes for a second, as if steadying himself. "Why?" "Because he's my son," I said. "Because he's all I have left of Henry." I heard my voice tremble, even though I didn't want it to. "If he goes to prison, I'll lose him forever." Caleb let out a slow breath. When he opened his eyes again, I saw something in them had changed. "You think you're protecting him," he said, "but you're teaching him that this is acceptable." "I just need more time," I said. "He'll come to his senses." Caleb's voice hardened for the first time since he arrived. "You're sacrificing yourself to preserve an illusion," he said, "and you're allowing them to continue." I didn't respond. I lowered my head. I knew he was right, but some things, no matter how true, are very hard to do. "Do you know what they'll do next?" Caleb asked. "They'll legalize everything, the paperwork, the locks, the narrative, and then there will be no way back." I looked up. "What do you want me to do?" Caleb met my eyes, his voice slower now. "Let me protect you." I shook my head. "Not yet, not now." The air in the guest house grew heavy. Caleb sat back down. He rubbed his forehead, as if calculating something difficult. "All right," he said finally, "I won't call the police today." I let out a breath, relieved but not happy. "But I'm going to start documenting everything," Caleb continued. "Dates, times, words, what they do. If anything else happens, I won't wait for your permission." I nodded. "Thank you." Caleb looked at me, his gaze softening slightly. "You're putting your child ahead of yourself. I understand, but one day you'll have to choose." I didn't answer. I knew that day was coming closer than I wanted to admit. I still believed that if I endured just a little longer, everything would come to a stop for me. I was wrong. That night, I was in the guest house. It was fully dark outside. I had just turned off the stove when I heard arguing coming from the main house. At first, I couldn't make out the words, just Ethan's voice louder than usual, then Laura's urgent, cutting in. I stood still. Not out of curiosity, but because I had grown used to not intervening. The voices grew louder. Something fell to the floor, then a silence so brief it was suffocating. After that, there was another impact, heavier, closer. I heard Laura call her husband's name, not loudly, not crying, just a call that was abruptly cut off. My heart began to race. I stepped outside and stood in the dark yard, looking toward the main house. The living room lights were still on. From a distance, everything looked perfectly normal, but I knew that what was happening inside was no longer just between my son and me. The front door opened. Laura stepped onto the porch. She stood there for a moment, arms wrapped around herself. Her clothes were disheveled. Her hair was messy. When she looked up, I saw her eyes were red, not from crying hard, but from trying to hold it back. She didn't see me at first. When she did, she froze. We looked at each other. There were no apologies, no accusations, just a late, shared realization. Ethan stood behind her. He said something I couldn't hear clearly, but his voice was sharp. Laura stepped back. In that moment, everything I had told myself collapsed. I had thought he had only lost control with me. I had thought he wouldn't go further. I had thought love would be enough to keep things within bounds, but violence has no limits. It only needs to be allowed once. Laura turned and went back inside. The door slammed shut. I stood there for a few more seconds, then turned back toward the guest house. My legs were shaking, but my mind was clear. I went inside, closed the door, and sat down at the table. I stared at my phone for a long time before picking it up. Caleb answered immediately. "Caleb," I said. My voice didn't shake. "It's time." He paused for a beat. "What just happened?" "It's not just about me anymore," I replied. "Do what you need to do." I hung up. I didn't cry. I just sat there, my hands resting on the table, breathing steadily. For the first time in a long while, I stopped making excuses for my child. I understood that if I stayed silent any longer, the next person could be anyone who stood close to him. And then, I would no longer be able to say that I didn't know. That night, I didn't sleep. But I was no longer confused. I had reached the point of no return. The police arrived early the next morning. I was sitting in the guest house when I heard a car stop at the gate. No sirens, no noise, just steady footsteps on the path I had known for decades. Caleb stood up in front of me. "Stay here," he said. "I'll handle it." I nodded. I no longer had the strength to argue, nor is there a reason to hold anything back. I looked out the window. 2 officers approached the porch of the main house. They knocked on the door, firm enough to be heard inside, not forceful enough to be confrontational. Ethan opened the door in his pajamas. His face tightened with irritation. I saw him say something, probably asking what this was about. One of the officers held out some papers. The other stood slightly to the side. I couldn't hear any words, but I saw the change on my son's face. Irritation turned into surprise, then into anger. Laura appeared behind him, throwing on a jacket. Her eyes were wide. She spoke rapidly. One of the officers raised a hand, signaling for her to calm down. Ethan looked around. Then he saw me standing at the door of the guest house. The distance between us wasn't far, but it had never felt so vast. "You did this!" he shouted. His voice echoed. Across the yard. I didn't answer. I didn't shake my head. I didn't defend myself. One officer placed a hand on his shoulder. Ethan pulled away. They said a few more things. Their voices stayed even, slow. When the handcuffs closed, there was no violent resistance, just shock. Laura called his name. She held his hand for a second before being told to step back. Ethan was led down the steps, his head lowered. As he passed me, he looked back one more time. There was no anger left in his eyes, only the panic of someone who had just realized he was no longer in control. I stood still until the car drove away. When the yard grew quiet again, I realized I was shaking. Caleb put a hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath. "I am." Not because I wasn't in pain, but because I was no longer hiding anything. For the first time in a long while, the truth had been spoken through action, not apologies or promises. And I knew that from this point on, things would never return to the way they were. But at least, they had stopped. The court hearing proceeded more quickly than I had expected. There were no loud arguments. No one slammed a desk. Everything took place in a bright, cold room where people spoke in steady voices and recorded every word carefully. I sat in the witness section. Caleb sat at the front, his back straight, files neatly arranged on the table. I didn't look around for Ethan. I knew where he was. When it was my turn, I stood up. My hands trembled slightly, but I didn't let it show much. I said what had happened, no more, no less. I discussed the documents. The incident involving the slap, the change to the bedroom lock in the guest house. No one interrupted me. When I spoke about signing papers while frightened and exhausted, I paused for a moment. I didn't cry. I simply stated the truth as it was. When it was Laura's turn, she spoke carefully. She said everything had been a misunderstanding. Ethan was under a great deal of pressure. I had been overly anxious since my husband passed away. However, the messages presented afterwards were not as careful. Laura's texts to Ethan were clearly visible, lines about needing to take control, to step up as the one in charge, to prove you're a man. The room grew noticeably quieter. When Henry's will was read, I heard again the words I had once read with him on a tranquil afternoon many years earlier. At the time, I had thought he was overly cautious. The clause was unambiguous. Ethan could only access the assets if he treated me properly. Any act of violence or coercion would void that right. I looked down at my hands. I remembered the tight grip on my arm. I remembered the bedroom door that wouldn't open. The judge didn't speak much. She said enough. The documents I had signed were declared invalid. The coercion was confirmed. Ownership of the house remained with me, just as it had from the beginning. Laura's family was required to leave the house. There were no loud objections. Just faces are changing very quickly. Laura lowered her head. Her parents stared straight ahead, silent. I sat down when permitted. My back ached, but I felt lighter. When the hearing ended, Caleb turned and looked at me. He didn't say anything. He simply nodded. I knew it wasn't a victory, just a necessary ending to something that had gone too far. And I also knew that the most challenging part was still ahead. After the hearing, I didn't go home right away. I sat on the wooden bench outside, waiting for everyone to leave. I needed a few minutes to catch my breath, to let my body catch up with what had just happened. Caleb stood a few steps away, not asking anything. He understood that what I needed right then was silence, not comfort. When I stood up, Caleb handed me an envelope. "Henry left this," he said. "It was in the will file. He said that if things ever went this far, it should be given to you." I took the envelope with both hands. My name was written on it in Henry's, familiar handwriting. I had seen that handwriting thousands of times, on grocery lists, on notes left on the kitchen table. And yet, my hands still trembled. I didn't open the letter right away. When I got home, I went straight into the living room. The house felt emptier than before, quieter. I sat down, placed the envelope on the table, and stared at it for a long time. Then I opened it. Henry didn't write much. He never spoke in circles. "Margaret," he wrote, "if you are reading this, it means I wasn't there to shield you the way I wanted to." I paused for a moment. I could hear his voice in my head clearly. He wrote that he had noticed slight changes in Ethan from the beginning. Nothing evil, just a sense of entitlement, as he called it, the feeling that being born into this family automatically gave him the right to decide. "I know you," Henry continued. "You will try to understand our son. You will think that love is enough to fix everything. I don't blame you for that. That's why I love you." He said the clause in the will wasn't meant to punish Ethan, but to create a boundary, not for our son, but for me. "I need you to know," he wrote, "that loving your child does not mean letting him hurt you." I closed my eyes for a moment. Tears fell onto the page, but I didn't wipe them away right away. Henry mentioned Caleb. He said he trusted my brother to be clear-headed enough to do the things I might hesitate to do, not because I was weak, but because I was a mother. "Don't choose guilt over peace," he wrote. "I don't want you to spend the rest of your life in fear just to preserve the image of a family that no longer exists as it once did." The last line was very short. "If there comes a time when you have to say no to our son, remember that I am on your side." I folded the letter and placed it back on the table. I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel more pain. For the first time in a long while, I felt permitted to let go without having to apologize. I met Ethan in the visitation room a week later. Caleb drove me there, but I went in alone. I wanted this conversation to be just between mother and son, no lawyers, no one in between. Ethan walked in a few seconds before I did. The prison uniform made him look smaller than I remembered. He sat down, hands resting on the table, eyes fixed on a spot on the tabletop as if concentrating on something tiny. When I sat across from him, he looked up. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry." I nodded. "I'm listening." He spoke quickly, as if afraid I might interrupt. He talked about pressure, about feeling inadequate, about Laura constantly telling him he had to take charge, about being angry at his father for putting everything in my name, about being angry at me for not letting go. "It all piled up," he said. "I lost control." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod to comfort him the way I used to. When he stopped, I spoke. "You have the right to feel tired, the right to feel angry, but you do not have the right to touch your mother. You do not have the right to force me out of my own home, and you do not have the right to use fear to make me sign anything." Ethan lowered his head. "I know." "Knowing now is not enough," I said. "I need you to understand." He looked up, eyes red. "You hate me now, don't you?" That question used to break me. This time, it didn't. "I don't hate you," I replied, "but I will not protect you by letting you continue to do wrong." He swallowed. "Will you forgive me?" I thought for a moment. I didn't answer right away. "I forgive you in the sense that I don't live to take revenge," I said, "but I am not returning to my old role." "What role?" he asked. "The role of a mother who endures everything to keep up appearances," I said. "The role of a victim." He was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Do I still have a family?" "You still have a chance," I said. "Family doesn't disappear because of a court case, but it only exists where there is respect." He nodded. I didn't know whether he nodded because he understood or because he had no choice but to do so, but that was no longer in my hands. "I want you to visit me," he said. "When you're ready." I stood up. "I'll decide that later." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. Before leaving, I turned back. "Use this time to learn how to be a man without controlling others," I said. "If one day you can do that, we can talk again." Ethan nodded, this time more slowly. I walked out and closed the door behind me. I didn't feel relieved, but I felt clear, and that was enough for that day. I returned home on a quiet afternoon. There were no police cars, no strangers at the gate, just me, a small bag, and the familiar path leading into the yard. I stood in front of the main door for a moment, not out of hesitation. I just needed to reacquaint myself with the feeling of walking in without asking anyone's permission. The key fit perfectly in my hand. The door opened smoothly. The house was quiet. No television, no voices, no unfamiliar footsteps. I walked slowly through the living room, touching the tabletop, the backs of the chairs. Everything was still there, but the air was different. I opened my bedroom door. The lock had been changed back. The bed was neatly made. The closet was emptier than before, but no longer locked. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't feel victorious. I only felt that I had returned to where I belonged. That evening, I cooked dinner for one person. I ate slowly, cleaned slowly, not in a rush, not because I was sad, but because there was no one left to avoid. Caleb stopped by later. He stood at the doorway, not stepping in right away. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded. "I am." He looked around the house. "Do you need me to stay?" "No," I said. "I need to learn how to be alone properly." Caleb smiled lightly. He understood. Before leaving, he said one short sentence. "You did the right thing." After he left, I turned off the lights, leaving one small lamp on in the living room. I sat down, thinking about everything that had happened. I am still Ethan's mother. That hasn't changed. But I am no longer the place for my child to unload his anger, exert control, or test boundaries. Family is not a place where the older person must stay silent to keep the peace. Family only exists where there is respect. When that is gone, boundaries must be set, even when it hurts. I don't know what Ethan's future will be. I don't know whether we will be able to sit at the same table again one day, but I know one thing. I kept this house. And more importantly, I kept myself. I turned off the lamp, went into the bedroom, and closed the door. This time I slept very deeply.